Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you for the welcome to be here today, and I wish you well on your continued agendas. Anne Hilton, I'm the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute, and I'm here to present Indigenomics, the rise of the Indigenous economy, as it's expressed through Indigenous economic empowerment. Indigenomics is essentially economics from an Indigenous worldview. To be able to bring a perspective of understanding how it has grown, why it's important, and why we should be paying attention to this. Indigenomics is the collective economic response to the lasting legacy of the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples in the development of this country. It's in this uncomfortable truth that our leadership and our space to create new actions is shaped and formed. To be able to establish that our response to now is to address that systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the economy of the region and this country. Indigenomics is essentially a design factor. It's about looking at the inheritance of the perspective of the concept of the Indian problem and how it has established and facilitated itself across the formation of Canada and reaching into today. To be able to understand the perspective of introducing the concept of economic distortion, I ask and call you into considerations of how we view the Indigenous population and how we also measure that relationship. When we understand that essentially the factors and metrics that describe the experience of that relationship can be established within the socioeconomic gap. To be able to understand that this is economic distortion in itself. When we can understand that Indigenous peoples have been disinvited systematically to the economic table of this country and this region, it is this place to be able to build from a place of leadership. At my work at the national level, what I began to see was the patterns of the narrative of the story of underdevelopment and that concept of the expression of the socioeconomic gap. When we look at this as a metric in time, this is a 2016 demonstration of the entirety of the Indigenous spend. What we could see is that 98% of expenditures for an entire year are focused within anything other than economic development. I suggest that the economic equation of this country does not make sense. To be able to see that the social cart is pulling the economic horse, that is being able to see this is the space for building the structures in response to Indigenous economic empowerment. Indigenomics as a concept is essentially about restoring the narrative away from Indigenous peoples are a fiscal burden towards we are an economic powerhouse. To be able to understand that and see that within the context of the rise of Indigenous economic empowerment, I want to introduce this concept of the emerging Indigenous economic space and how that is reflecting in our regional reality and national reality. What makes up this economic space? To be able to understand in the work of Bill Gallagher, who establishes the metrics of how many of these legal wins have been created. When we look at these examples and see them demonstrated within the weekly media narrative of this country, we see a steep incline of Indigenous wins expressing itself largely within the resource sector, but essentially creating this concept of new emerging Indigenous economic space. Next, I introduce the concept of a right to an economy. We are in an environment right now where we need to consider the implications of the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. To be able to understand that as an expression of the right to an economy, I essentially posit that Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have had to fight for a right to an economy. I refer to specifically my own reality as a New Channel person, where we took Canada to court to have the right to sell fish. I also posit that essentially we can't have it both ways. We can't live in a country that says Indigenous peoples do not have the right to modern function of commerce or the exchange of fish for money in the market. When we understand that this expression of the right to an economy is being facilitated daily within this country and region, we need to pay attention to what the implementation of UNDRIP looks like and how that supports the rise of Indigenous economic empowerment. In looking at this concept of this evolving economic space, that is in parallel to the evolving Indigenous relationship. The most recent win here in BC, how a big win for a First Nation in BC could bring change for resource development in Canada. Here we see the impacts of accumulative effects and essentially how that shifts industry, how that shifts investment, how that shifts government regulations. It becomes essential to pay attention to the structure and features of this evolving relationship. This is essentially about a shift in social and economic meaning. The concept of the Indian problem that has weaved through the language of policy and the regulatory environment is now shifting towards the language and structure of Indigenous economic empowerment. If we look at some of these trends, we see an increasing focus that over 20% of Canada's land base is controlled directly by First Nations. This is a shifting sphere of influence, and again, referring to these legal cases and how that is adjusting and playing out within the economic field. In this chart, I demonstrate a series of metrics that essentially rudimentary measurements of the size of the Indigenous economy. In 2010, we saw it valued at 10 billion, 2012 at 12, 2014 at 16, and 2016 was the last measurement at 32. To be able to understand the escalation and force of growth of Indigenous economic activity, essentially being able to understand that the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy, we're not only in it, we're looking at it. And to shape our social and economic meaning is an essential response to now. I refer to a national study that identifies the National Indigenous Economic Development Board that suggests that we are looking at untapped economic value of the Indigenous workforce. To be able to understand the underutilization of the Indigenous workforce and correlate that to economic value, we are in a place within this country and region where we need to establish an economic equation that makes sense in building our future. Indigenomics is essentially modern, constructive, generative Indigenous economic design. The specificity of our modernity is we have defined our space in establishing what are our rights, who we are, our ways of being, and demonstrating that within our businesses and economies. What is essential is to be both constructive and generative. Indigenous peoples cannot exist solely within the cost side of the equation, which moves towards this concept of Indigenous economic design. The growth of the Indigenous economy cannot exist within government programs or services. To actually have the design, structures, tools, and functions to be able to support and elevate Indigenous economic activity, that is Indigenomics in action. To place this concept into our reality of the emerging $100 billion annual Indigenous economy, it is essential to be able to address what is our collective response. Indigenomics as a concept is essentially about convening the tools, the structures, the resources, and the leadership in the emerging Indigenous economy. To be able to establish our response is essentially asking the question, if the last metric or the measurement of the Indigenous economy was 32 billion, where is our leadership in that push towards increased Indigenous economic activity at $100 billion level? How do we address our investment structures, our tools, the capitalization, and the requirements to be able to meet the growing demand of Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses? The process of value creation in the emerging Indigenous economy. It's essential to be able to pay attention to the bigger questions of both what we know and what we need to know. I ask that, what is it that we actually know about the Indigenous economy? What are our markers of success? How and where do we see increasing visibility of the size of Indigenous economy regionally? What does the increasing visibility of capitalization of the Indigenous economy look like? Where are we seeing increasing visibility of Indigenous entrepreneurs? To be able to understand that the essential language of moving out of a problem frame or a cost perspective towards collaborative approaches to funding community economic development, this is the response. The required structures for Indigenous economic growth are essential to pay attention to. This is essentially about facilitating our relationships for economic success. And while if I had more time with you today, I would introduce further the concept of Indian Act economics. I essentially suggest that while we have a series of differing definitions of Indigenous governance across 630 plus nations of this country, 203 approximately within BC, 4 particularly within the Vancouver region, to be able to understand that every single person on this call today has been affected by Indian Act economics. To understand the economic regression of Indigenous peoples, the experience of that, and the perception of Indigenous peoples being a cost on the system. To be able to move away from Indian Act economics is to be able to support the structures of constructive, generative Indigenous economies and investment into the tools and structures of increasing Indigenous economic activity. I suggest essentially the growth of the Indigenous economy is happening in spite of Indian Act economics. I suggest that there are 2 forms of economy happening in this country. There's economy as we know it, of how it's reflected and measured and reported back to us. And there's Indian Act economics. To be able to take hold of that concept that every single person here in the room or virtually today is impacted by Indian economics, this is the intersection that we exist within today. To understand our response to Indigenous economic exclusion historically, to invest into the leadership, the tools and structures of Indigenous economic design today is the antithesis essentially of Indian Act economics. In bringing our perspective today, Indigenomics has essentially brought to the forefront the patterns and trends in the narrative and language of the media as its depiction of Indigenous business and economies. Here we see a $1 billion boom. UNDRIP opens the door to First Nations partnership. When we can understand that we are looking at a $1 billion opportunity as expressed within the implementation of UNDRIP, the questions that we need to be asking is, what is it we understand about the Indigenous economy? What data supports that? What does investment look like into that? And how do we support the visibility of Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs? I would like to reflect momentarily on Made in Vancouver Indigenous businesses, of success stories that represent the evolution of Indigenous business. The first being Squamish Lodge is the first Indigenous boutique hotel. It is Canada's first Indigenous arts hotel and is structured as a social enterprise. To be able to understand the success of this, of placing it into regional context of the success of Indigenous business, the visibility of Indigenous business, and being able to do it in a community manner that not only supports Indigenous artists, but the function and model of business itself is to be paid attention to. Next, looking at Vancouver Indigenous Fashion Week, essentially a structure that was inaugural within Canada as a whole. To understand the success of this, the attraction of being able to look at alternative representation of fashion and to look at that as a built-in Vancouver perspective of Indigenous business success. Next, we see also related is a supernaturals modeling agency, where it's looking at redefining Indigenous beauty standards and access to the fashion industry within Indigenous terms and approaches and ways of being. To understand the potential of impact of this, to understand and place this into the reality of a story of Indigenous business success as made in Vancouver. These are business models to be proud of, to pay attention to, and to be able to invest into their success and participation within the region. Esqueo Air is the first Indigenous-owned airline operating out of Vancouver Airport. This is a business to pay attention to essentially understand as the first Indigenous-owned, also Indigenous women-owned, essentially creating the space of entrepreneurial leadership in a place that has never had Indigenous space or representation. And while this business across its value stream from the mechanics and testing and development of the planes themselves is establishing the space for Indigenous skill set and workforce development that is designed for Indigenous inclusion. Next, we look at one of an original Indigenous businesses that is a story of success that is world-renowned. Salmon and Bannock is essentially described as an essential business to come to as reflected within the tourism industry. Understanding the distinction of the approach of Indigenous business, Indigenous ways of being, Indigenous business models, it is essential to uphold and uplift these as examples of made in Vancouver. Next, we look at the MST Property Development Corporation, comprising 3 Vancouver area-based nations, embarking on smaller profits, but establishing a circular model for social and community development. Seeing this placed within a structural relationship between the 3 local nations, understanding the potential of economic impact has never been seen to this degree before within the region. Understanding that essentially these nations have made themselves a seat at the economic table, for which so long our people have been excluded. Next, we look at the Sinop development, which is over $1 billion development for Squamish Nation, which centers the nation to not only be one of the largest landowners, but essentially this is the face of Indigenous economic empowerment. To understand that the alignment between lands management, development, capitalization, and the understanding of the progress of a Squamish local economy is essential to place into our reality that Indigenous peoples are powerful people. The representation of our economic growth, our place within the region, it is in examples like this, the development of this scale can essentially change the skyline of the city of Vancouver as a renowned global world-class city. We are a powerful people. It's time to be able to reflect on the development of this narrative and where we are seeing it and how we pay attention to that. And finally, again, we see the Squamish Nation signing $1 billion land deal that will see LNG plant ship gas to Asia. At a $1.1 billion construction amount, the establishment of the Squamish Nation, of the requirement for having a seat at the economic table, everything looks different. To be able to understand that resources to market to international markets, Indigenous peoples now must have a seat at the economic table. And while we may have seen pieces of the development of this narrative, this hard reality now is essentially requiring new language, new decision-making, systems of inclusion, and the ability to see Indigenous peoples as powerful economic powerhouses. Finally, this year, we saw, and while the conflict happened on the Atlantic coast, essentially understanding that this development of billion-dollar deals and equity ownership is becoming the new narrative within this country. Establishing the metrics of economic clout in itself, we can come to understand that reconciliation in Canada is essentially about Indigenous peoples taking our seat at the economic table. Indigenous equity ownership is the new normal. When we look at this trend across the country and then come back to bring our focus and attention of how this is expressing itself within the regional economy, this is what is essential to see. While I bring you outside of the region to look at some patterns and trends that are happening, the emerging visibility of the structure of the $100 billion Indigenous economic activity, we see these in multiple examples. Starting on the left, we see this year, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank directed to invest $1 billion into Indigenous infrastructure projects. When we look at the multiple factor of Indigenous economic impact, it is here that we see the pathways of the $100 billion Indigenous economy. This year, the First Nations Finance Authority announced that they had reached a major milestone, surpassing $1 billion of loans into the Indigenous communities. We see the project reconciliation advancing $1 billion wealth fund with an eye on an equity ownership within a significant piece of infrastructure in Canadian reality. Alberta creates $1 billion fund for Indigenous investment in energy. And finally, also this year, we saw a national target of 5% procurement of Indigenous businesses, to understand that that 5% target, if met annually, essentially expresses itself as $1 billion of Indigenous economic activity. We saw this year, the federal budget, $18 billion invested into stepping towards closing the socioeconomic gap. I suggest that investing money into closing the socioeconomic gap is a response as an absence of actual Indigenous economic design. To understand that our ability to respond to structured Indigenous economic design, we will be closing the socioeconomic gap for a long time without a plan. In putting this in the context of economic reconciliation, Indigenomics acts as a platform for economic reconciliation, described as essentially the space between the lived realities of Indigenous peoples, the need to build understanding of the importance of the Indigenous relationship, and the requirement for progressive actions for economic inclusion. This is the space for leadership and inclusion within the region, to understand the effects of the lived realities of exclusion, the need to build understanding of the Indigenous relationship, and essentially, what does progressive actions look like for Indigenous economic inclusion? In regards to the $100 billion Indigenous economy, it is time to get ready. It is within reach, it is possible, and it's time. It's time to be able to ask the question, who wants to play Indigenomics? To be able to center our leadership into the investment of a regional Indigenous economy, to bring visibility to Indigenous entrepreneurs, the required investment, and the visibility of the Indigenous economy. To be able to understand and place this within the context that Indigenous peoples are taking a seat at the economic table, that Indigenous peoples are powerful and economic powerhouses. I encourage you within your work to bring your leadership into what is progressive actions for Indigenous economic inclusion. Thank you, and let's have the courage to do this together.